Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm president of Bay Area Skeptics. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Gail Sinatra, professor of psychology and education at the University of Southern California and associate dean for research in the Rossier School of Education. Gail is a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, a member of the National Academy of Education, and the recipient of many awards, including the International Award for Excellence from the International Journal of Climate Change. She has also received awards for teaching and mentoring, which is also pretty important. Her areas of research include the public understanding of science, science learning, knowledge construction, and learning theory. She and her students have been developing a model of the role of motivational and emotional factors influencing how individuals will change their opinions about socially, if not scientific topics such as evolution and climate change. She has written Science Denial, Why It Happens and What to Do About It, with co-author Barbara Hofer. The book examines psychological explanations for why people deny science, but it goes beyond just the what to suggest solutions for turning people away from science denial, as the subtitle suggests, what to do about it. Psychologist Craig Foster, whom you may remember as one of our speakers, I think in December of last year, described it as a superb book devoted to a superb cause. Welcome to Bay Area Skeptics, Gail.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jeannie.
Well, we're so delighted to have you. And I got to say, this is personally one of my favorite topics. You and I have known each other for a while. When I was not a lady of leisure in my retirement here, I spent a lot of time with people who did not want to accept evolution. And eventually, the organization I worked for, the National Center for Science Education, also added climate science because the parallels were very similar. A very good science, a perfectly valid, legitimate science was being attacked for ideological reasons. And I think your work is extremely important in helping us understand how these things can come about. I know in my, traveling around the country, speaking for different organizations, I imagine you've had the same sort of thing. A lot of people will come up and say, I don't get it. Why can't they just understand the science and just the scales fall from their eyes and everything be perfect from here on? And I think people like you and people who have made a study of science rejection, denialism, referred to in various ways, know that just shoveling on more science isn't going to solve the problem. Am I right about that?
You're exactly right. I'm a huge fan of your work and all that you've done over the years and your leadership in this area, Jeannie. You're an inspiration.
Well,
and you know that we both worked on evolution understanding. And then, I found that, unfortunately, climate change is very similar. And we'll talk about that tonight in the ways they're similar. But unfortunately, we're seeing the same sort of pushback.
but also different in some very important ways.
Mhm.
I mean, structurally, I think we'll probably learn from your talk that there's a lot of structural similarities, but the devil is in the details, which is an appropriate phrase for this kind of topic, I guess. But enough about our interest in one another's work. Let's hear what you have to tell the Bay Area skeptics. We're very much looking forward to this.
Well, thank you. I'm very excited, and I'm ready to go.
All right, we'll see you. I'll see you after your talk for some questions.
That sounds great. Well, as you heard, my talk is about, is it skepticism or is it denial? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And a sub-theme throughout this talk will be about how there's an erosion of trust in scientific expertise. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So as Jeannie mentioned, this is the book that Barbara Hofer and I published in 2021, Science Denial, Why It Happens and What to Do About It. And it does form the basis for many of my remarks tonight. But we have to start with, why does it matter? Why does the public understanding of science matter? Well, in democratic societies, we depend on citizens to be able to make informed decisions about scientific issues for the good of their health, for their well-being, for their communities, for our nation, for the planet. And you're all aware that these issues are challenging: vaccination, climate change, fracking, stem cell research, genetically modified organisms, the pandemic response. So it's really challenging for people to evaluate scientific claims and understand the premises of science. That's really quite challenging. And what we see is a huge disconnect between scientists' informed opinions and that of the general public. Just to give you a couple of topics, is it safe to eat GMOs? Vast majority of scientists' research suggests that it is. They believe that it is. The public's not so sure. We definitely see these schisms in other areas. We talked about, Jeannie and I just now, climate change, or global warming as it was called, and then humans being related to other living things and their evolution over time. And you can see these schisms between scientists and the public's perspective. So why does this schism matter? I just love this picture because what it shows is the actual line in the sand. So this is how we enact our understanding of science, and this is why it matters. This is the beach border between two counties in Florida, and they had very different stay-at-home policies in April 2020, and you'll all remember where we were with the pandemic in April 2020. So there's a literal line in the sand, and I think this really just visually brings home the issue of why it matters, how we understand science, and how we enact our understanding of it. So basically, what I'm arguing is we all need to make informed decisions about scientific issues. And that's why we want to talk tonight about the issues of science denial, but not just denial. There's also a lot of doubt and resistance. So we want to talk first about denial, then about doubt, and then about resistance, and what these terms really mean and how we talk about them in the book. But one thing very clearly we want to bring out right at the start: we are all susceptible to this. This is not a personality characteristic. There's not a group of science deniers. In fact, we've probably all resisted some scientific information until we maybe found out more about it. We've probably all doubted something now and then. So we want to keep in mind that this is not an us or them issue, and I think that's very important to understand. So how do we define these terms? Well, we say that denial, which actually is the rarest, thank goodness, is a belief-based stance and a rejection of scientific evidence. Now, this kind of thing is like climate change is a hoax, and we see people making those kinds of statements. That's flat out denial. The earth is flat. That's an obvious scientific denial. Vaccines cause autism, been debunked, over and over again, consistently. But what's a little more common than flat out denial is what we call cafeteria denial. This is actually not that uncommon. And this is when people pick and choose what to believe and what to deny. After all, members of the Flat Earth Society get on a plane, fly to the meeting, and then tweet about it from their iPhones. Much more common still is doubt and resistance, especially when the findings of a scientific field or study don't fit with our personal beliefs, or if they conflict with a closely held social identity, or if they require deeper analysis and deep thinking that not everybody is willing, able, or interested to do. Now, one thing to also keep in mind, again, so that we don't sort of sometimes blame the victim, is that doubt and resistance is often manufactured. This is especially true for things that have a vested interest. And Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, you're probably very familiar with, captured this well in Merchants of Doubt. This is the picture of the tobacco industry execs swearing in front of Congress that smoking's fine, definitely not bad for your health. So doubt can be manufactured and people fall prey to this. And I think we have to keep in mind that sometimes can happen. In fact, does happen quite often. Now, what about skepticism? Well, you are all aware that skepticism is a healthy aspect of science, a necessary part of science. And we definitely need to be skeptical, particularly of like one-off studies. Barbara and I were looking at a study that showed eating chocolate for breakfast helps you lose weight. We were both pretty excited that maybe this was a great study, but we were appropriately skeptical because the study had no control group, very few participants, and it just wasn't a sound study. So of course, we need to be skeptical. But a caveat, some individuals, we're seeing this more and more, become overly skeptical and then become skeptical of everything. And this leads to a breakdown of trust in science. So now you should ask, well, why trust science at all? Well, again, going back to Naomi Oreskes in her wonderful book called Why Trust Science, science relies on empirical evidence and carefully collects and analyzes data. And science builds on prior findings and accumulates evidence over time. But even more important than those basics is that it's a collective enterprise and it relies on peer review, vetting of ideas, theories, and results. And yet, we all have to keep in mind, and we all probably know, that science is definitely not infallible. But the key thing is why we should trust science in the long run is that it has a self-correcting mechanism. In addition to Oreskes, we also draw quite a bit on Lee McIntyre, another philosopher of science, who talks about the value of a scientific attitude. And that is really something important that we can all adopt and promote. And that is an openness to seek new evidence and a willingness to change one's mind in light of new evidence. And that, to me, and Barbara in our book, we claim is really the most important thing we can develop. All right, now getting to the psychological explanations that we cover in the book on why people tend to doubt, deny, and resist. So I'm just going to go over these 5 this evening in the interest of time. And those are mental shortcuts, motivated reasoning, emotions and attitudes, social identity, and something called epistemic cognition. Don't worry, I'll define that. First, mental shortcuts. Well, we all have these. So this is when we over-rely on what psychologists call system 1. System 1 is our quick thinking, very intuitive, and it's not system 2, which is more deliberative and analytic. So when we do that, we sometimes let biases come in, something like you've probably heard of, confirmation bias. That's when we're seeking, interpreting, and recalling information that aligns with our pre-existing beliefs and basically confirms what we already thought. Or maybe, as Senator Inhofe from the great state of Oklahoma is illustrating here, maybe we have an availability heuristic, which is we're using information that we have available to us, and this creates a false balance when misinformation is available. And if you don't recall this incident, Senator Inhofe was trying to prove that climate change isn't real because it had snowed late in the season in DC, and he brought a snowball onto the Senate floor to prove that climate change wasn't real. One of the studies we just published in Climatic Change, my colleagues and I, was what kind of messages click with people with this intuitiveness, this intuitive system one thinking. We explored a variety of climate terms, and we wanted to trigger reactions to them and see which ones, quote, work best to help people understand climate change. We had a nationally representative sample of 6,000 participants, and we tested global warming, climate change, climate emergency, climate crisis, climate justice. And it turns out that we're better off using the terms people are familiar with, global warming and climate change, rather than some of these new terms people have tried to use to evoke more of a sense of urgency. We found that the regular old terms were better because people understood them more, and they actually promoted more of a sense of willingness to do something about the challenges in front of us, which was surprising, but that's why we do the research. Moving to motivated reasoning, you've probably all heard that term. What happens with motivated reasoning is motivations can bias our understanding of research. For example, we can decide what evidence to accept based on the conclusions we prefer. This has been shown in research over and over that individuals are much more critical of the methodology of a research study if they don't like the outcome. It's very, very likely that our motivated reasoning is closely related to our identity. What about our emotions and attitudes? Well, we have shown in our research that emotions about scientific information and attitudes towards that information, in this particular study I did with my colleagues about GMOs, emotions are associated with attitudes and also associated with misconceptions. In other words, people who had misconceptions, wrong non-scientific ideas about GMOs also had negative attitudes about them and negative emotions, as one might suspect. We used what's called a refutation text, basically a very specific way to tell people that information isn't correct. Here is what is correct. We found that can reduce misconceptions and negative emotions. Once misconceptions and negative emotions are reduced, we also found a shift in the attitudinal valence from more negative to more positive. This was just one study, but we just published a couple of weeks ago a large-scale meta-analysis showing dozens and dozens of these studies using refutation text is an effective technique for reducing people's misinformation belief. Moving on to social identity. This is a big one. So science denial is hardly new. It's been around since science itself. But today, and over the past 20 years or so, it's been particularly amplified through social media, through information, great, but then misinformation and disinformation. This is a shot from the film Don't Look Up. Barbara and I were invited to the premiere of this film, and we were very excited to go because, of course, it is an allegory, I guess you could say, for the climate crisis. So how do we make sense of scientific claims in a digital world? And how do individuals decide what knowledge to accept as valid? Well, research in social psychology shows that it's really our in-group identity which strongly influences our views of science. And regrettably, we all saw this with COVID. So whoever was in your Facebook group, your friend group, your church group, your political group, your school group, if they were getting vaccinated, you were more likely to get vaccinated. If they were not getting vaccinated, you were less likely to get vaccinated. So identifying with a group that questions vaccines or mask wearing during a pandemic is going to lead that person to adopt those less protective behaviors. We also know that you are much more likely to believe a scientific article posted by a friend on Facebook than by an expert. And we've all heard of social media bubbles. So what happens is you hear misinformation, your friend shares the same misinformation, and you think, oh, there must be something to this because everybody in my group is saying it. So this leads to an erosion of trust in expertise. And we saw that, unfortunately, so borne out during the coronavirus height of the pandemic. Is there anything you can do about that? Yes, there is. In this particular study that we did on conservation of water, in-group messages are more persuasive, no doubt. But what you can do is you can change the in-group. So what we did is we compared a communication strategy based on what's called the knowledge deficit view to identity frames. So I don't know how many of you have ever gotten a information from your water company or electric company that shows your usage compared to your neighbors. So what happens when you do that, unfortunately, you see that the guy next door is using more water than me. You actually end up using more water. It doesn't help you conserve. But what we did is we changed the social identity of the message by invoking a different identity. That is of Southern Californians. We said, we Southern Californians, we conserve water. People who got the we message conserved more water. And we did this in August in Southern California, and we actually measured water consumption. All right, now on to epistemic cognition and getting into the meat of the matter related to the concerns of the group here tonight. Well, what is epistemic cognition? Well, let's start with what's the epistemology of science. So epistemology, most of you know, the study of knowledge and knowing and how we know. According to the AAAS, there are these basic tenets, beliefs that scientists share. The world is understandable through systematic study. That's the natural world. Science cannot provide complete answers to all questions. Scientific knowledge is durable. And scientific ideas are subject to change. And what's interesting about this last one is that individuals often confuse tentativeness for uncertainty, and they don't understand the changing nature of science. Sometimes individuals feel that's a weakness, but actually that's the biggest strength of science, is the opportunity to change based on new evidence that suggests a change is warranted. Now back to epistemic cognition. That's how individuals think about knowledge and knowing. Where does knowledge come from? How do I gain knowledge? How do other people get knowledge? My co-author and I had written much about this prior to working on the book together. And how one thinks about knowledge influences your scientific understanding. So it's how individuals think and reason about knowledge and knowing. What is knowledge? How do we know what we know? What are the sources of knowledge and why? And why do we trust those sources, or why do we not trust other sources? All of this has a big impact on our scientific understanding. And it's particularly critical when individuals have to decide What counts as evidence? When individuals have to resolve competing knowledge claims, evaluate information critically. What if they have to integrate multiple sources of information, very typical today? And how do they incorporate new knowledge into their understanding? So a little basic developmental psychology here about epistemic cognition. And that is, how does it really develop over time in a student over time? Again, epistemic cognition, how we think about knowledge, how do we weigh competing truth claims, how do we decide which authority to trust? A typical developmental pattern of that we've seen in the literature is individuals tend to go from absolutist to multiplist to evaluativist. So those mouthfuls I'll explain. An absolutist may interpret that, well, the fact that only 97% of climate scientists agree about the causes of climate change, well, we don't have consensus, so it's not certain. That's an absolutist point of view. And young children, as they begin to learn about complex scientific topics, often are in this stage of their thinking. As students get more sophisticated, they turn to multiplism and become multiplists. And that is this idea that all knowledge is tentative, so then it's all relative. And so scientific claims are just one set of options, and they're just as good as anyone else's idea. You may have also heard of this as relativism. This is really common among middle schoolers, maybe even high schoolers. And unfortunately, you may know some adults who think this way. As students go through school, high school, into even college, they can become evaluativists. And evaluativists, they have a sense of the relative nature of uncertainty. They're willing to be weighing criteria for evaluating knowledge claims. They're going to evaluate sources and question the authority of those sources. And basically, this is pretty much what a skeptic is supposed to do. I think if I'm wrong about that, I'm sure the group will correct me. And it's a prudent use of evidence. Now, another important concept that relates to all of this is epistemic trust. And this is really a problem that we have today. What sources of knowledge do individuals trust? There has been a precipitous decline, particularly post-COVID, in trust in authorities and experts. Again, back to social identity. Social identity really determines whether you believe Dr. Fauci is a hero or a villain. So social identity influences our epistemic trust in experts and which individuals we believe and which individuals we don't want to trust. It's important to point out there's good reasons for distrust, particularly among marginalized communities or historically communities that have been mistreated, unfortunately, by science and scientists in our past, have good reasons to be a little leery. So that's understandable. But as I mentioned, trust levels pre-pandemic were not great, but they have dropped precipitously since COVID. Trust is down. You probably can't see this slide too well, so I'm going to go through it with you. Trust is down for medical scientists, regular scientists, public school principals. You might guess that has to do with school closures, and you'd be right, and mask policies, etc. Elected officials, that's really low. These numbers, for those of you who can't see them, in the dark blue and light blue are a great deal and a fair amount. The great deal levels of trust are very low in these graphs, in the 20s and 30s, and of course, bottoming out into the single digits for politicians. Why has this happened? Many, many reasons why trust in expertise has been eroding. One, there's been a systematic effort on the part of politicians to erode the public's trust in government, in higher education, in medicine for decades. I think definitely since the 80s, it's been a real push in that direction. And it's important to remember, this is not just exclusively on one or the other side of the political spectrum. There is a little bit more of it on the political right, but definitely not exclusively. Childhood vaccines, in fact, were highly trusted by Republicans, much more highly so than Democrats, prior to COVID, and now are not. And then we have on the other side of the political spectrum, health influencers online. If you don't know what the health influence market is, it's a billion-dollar industry of people on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram selling you natural remedies, but often these are untested, unproven, definitely unscientific, and sometimes dangerous. The health influencer population tends to lean politically left. So unfortunately, we have this erosion of epistemic trust and a erosion of belief in scientific and medical experts, both on the right and in the left. Tom Nichols famously wrote The Death of Expertise, said the foundational knowledge of the average American is now so that it has crashed through the floor of uninformed, past misinformed on the way down, and is now plummeting to aggressively wrong. And what I liked about that quote is the aggressively wrong part. We certainly saw people being extremely aggressively wrong about COVID policies. And again, sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right. And what happens is your trust can be eroded, and politicians might tell you they're the only ones you can trust. As Donald Trump has famously once said, I alone can fix it. Why has this happened? Well, the internet is a big factor in this. The internet democratized both expertise and ignorance. Everything's on the internet. That's both good and bad because everything is on there. Great scientific information, studies on climate change you can find from all over the world, and then a ton of mis and disinformation. Also, there are reasons to have some mistrust. Certainly scandals, corruption, medical mistakes. Those have contributed to mistrust of experts. You all remember when Dr. Fauci said we didn't need a mask, then he said we did. I don't think that was so much of a mistake as it was a misunderstanding of a novel, new coronavirus and not knowing exactly how it spread, but it clearly created a great deal of mistrust. So who is it that you are going to trust if you don't trust experts? Well, we already know that's your in-group members. Back to Tom Nichols, in another quote from him, Americans now believe that having equal rights in a political system also means that each person's opinion about anything must be accepted as equal to anyone else's. So his argument is, and we could debate this in the question period, and I don't have the answers to whether he's right or wrong, but his argument is, as we have tried to talk about equality, people have taken that good concept of humans, are all equal and spread it to all ideas are equal, which obviously isn't true. And Senator Ron Johnson famously once said during the coronavirus, what drives me nuts is when I'm challenged by medical experts. Well, I think he may have been a football coach, but he definitely wasn't a doctor. All right, so what can be done? Because as Jeannie mentioned in our book, we didn't want to just problematize this because, quite frankly, everyone knows it's a problem. We wanted to talk about, can you do anything about it? So we have recommendations, starting with what you can do, what I can do, what can individuals do? Well, back to Lee McIntyre, cultivate a scientific attitude and an appreciation for the nature of science. This is something that I don't even really need to say to this group, but this is a really important one for all the other groups that I talk to, because people often think that it's only STEM majors that need to learn science, that the rest of us don't really need it. And that's absolutely untrue. A scientific attitude helps you in your day-to-day life, problem solving, what to do about, your car won't work and the back door doesn't lock anymore. You're better off approaching these problems with a scientific attitude. Improve your search skills. Everybody finds information about science online now, and we have to learn how to evaluate claims and sources. I have a large National Science Foundation grant right now with colleagues from the University of Maryland, and we're teaching teachers to teach kids how to source and then evaluate scientific information online. We teach them a couple of strategies. One is called lateral reading. Most people open a window on the internet and Google something and then read down. What we tell students is don't do that. Open a second window and look for the source of the information that first popped up. Is it reliable? Do other people confirm that information, or is it just a one-off source? Who is that source? Are they trying to sell you something? Then you have to evaluate the scientific claims. We have a whole method for doing that. If anyone asks me in the question period, I'll tell you about it. And it turns out middle schoolers can learn this really well. Be aware of our own cognitive biases and our own motivations, because again, we are all subject to this if we're not vigilant. So heightening our own awareness of our biases and motivations helps us to become better reasoners. And this is a big one, and I really wish we could do more of this. Listen to others, and those particularly who have a different point of view from yours, and listen with curiosity, compassion, and openness. I remember my niece told me when the vaccines came out, she's 30 years old, she said, I'm not going to get vaccinated because I heard from my Facebook friend it causes infertility. So instead of saying, oh, that's silly, that's dumb, I said, oh, wow, I haven't heard that. I can see that would be a concern of yours. I know you want to start a family. That's an important concern. I think you should check it out. Maybe you should talk to your doctor. She did talk to her doctor. Her doctor told her that that was not a risk. She got vaccinated, and happy ending to this story, she went back to her Facebook friend and convinced her to get vaccinated as well. Vote. All over the country, in different races, there are individuals who are on ballots at local, state, national offices who value support and willing to fund science, who want to base policy decisions and science on evidence and support those people. I'm an educator, so what do educators do? What can they do? Well, educators need to enhance their own scientific understanding because research shows that elementary school teachers, unfortunately, don't really have any better understanding of science than most members of the general public. High school teachers have usually a degree in biology, chemistry, physics, if they're teaching science. Unfortunately, not always, but they often do. But all teachers need a better understanding of science. We need to teach kids about the nature of science, all that epistemic cognition stuff I was talking about earlier. We need kids to understand what science is, how it knows what it knows, why it doesn't know certain things, and how does it figure things out. That's almost more important than a bunch of facts. And well, I think it is more important than a bunch of facts because, as we said, science facts can change. We really want to foster scientific thinking in all students. I mentioned this before. This is not just about STEM ed and people going into engineering. We need engineers for sure. We need doctors for sure. But we need all individuals to be able to think and reason scientifically for their day-to-day lives and for their jobs, the thinking and reasoning on their jobs, no matter what their jobs are. It's really important to teach real-world applications of science. We have great ideas about how to do that, and we've been doing it in a bunch of different projects I'd be happy to tell you about. We have a wonderful climate justice instructional strategy we've been using that's so exciting. I'd love to tell you about. Kids love it. Kids need to choose their own areas of inquiry. Just telling kids to read a textbook in science is super boring, and hopefully you weren't taught science that way. If you were, you might not be here at this event tonight because you developed some interest in it. Let kids choose what areas they want to study. Be aware of strong prior beliefs, attitudes, and identities. You would be surprised how many teachers do and don't understand what their kids come to the understanding of science with. What do they think before they come to your classroom? And understand how to recognize and manage students' emotions. Again, I can talk to you about that a little bit more in the question period. And foster digital scientific literacy, just like the grant I told you about, and we are trying to do that. What about science communicators? We really talk a lot to science communicators and tell them to write more about science for the general public. I'm sure that you're all aware how local newspapers have died and are dying out. Local newspapers used to be quite prominent, and they used to have science sections, and there's fewer of both. We encourage communicators to write as much about how scientists know what they know as what they know. How do they know that? And for the science communicators to have a better understanding of the likely misconceptions, motivations, attitudes, and identities of their readers. Provide the evidence for scientific claims, not just this is what happened, but what's the evidence that leads scientists to think that? Why did we go to mask wearing? That was so poorly explained to people. And both sides are for opinions, not for science. So we need to get away from putting one climate denier on the screen with one climate scientist. That's very misleading and gives this impression that it's a 50-50 jump ball. We recommend that policymakers hire and listen to science advisors and use that scientific evidence to make policy. We need to do this to confront the climate crisis. We need to stop arguing about it and start working on it. We need to support educational standards that help students learn how to think over just what to think. In other words, it shouldn't just be a list of facts and science. It should help them develop thinking and reasoning skills. We need more pushback on completely unfactual claims. I saw something online yesterday that a homeschool parent was asking a teacher to provide her a flat earth curriculum, and the teacher was looking for one. I find that simply terrifying. We need to demand more rigorous teacher preparation standards. Our teachers, as I mentioned, don't have enough science understanding to teach it. I once did a project using Hot Wheels cars and tracks called speedometry. Went into 2,000 kids, classrooms of 2,000 kids over a period of weeks. And most of the teachers that I spoke to said that was the first time they'd ever taught science. That's heartbreaking. And press social media. Okay, well, this is never going to happen, but I can put a wish list together. Press social media to be more responsible, transparent, and accountable. They are the big spreaders of misinformation. They monetize misinformation. In other words, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Thank you very much. That is the end of my talk, and I'm very excited to be taking some questions from you and having further conversation.
Thank you, Gail. That was a wonderful, cogent summary of some of your ideas, not just from the book, but from your research as well. There's plenty more where that came from, folks, by the way. But this is a good introduction to some ways of thinking about some extremely important issues. Do you mind, while we're waiting for questions to evolve and be assembled, can I just nitpick for a minute?
Sure,
Okay.
of course.
I mean, we're friends. I can do this with you. I am two things. Okay. Number one, you and probably many people who watch this series know that I'm a hopeless Pollyanna, but I'm not totally a hopeless Pollyanna. I do have my reasonable, let's look at the evidence aspects of it. But also, I'm sort of minorly triggered by the idea that Americans are suddenly anti-science. You didn't say that. You were talking, very specifically about specific manifestations of science misunderstandings, mistakes that people make thinking about how science works or not understanding it, and that was wonderful. But many people do go away with the idea that Americans are suddenly anti-science.
Right.
And
I definitely do not mean to imply that.
Yeah, I just don't see that at all. I know we had our Skeptical annual conference last month before that, July. How the time flies. Those of you who attended have access to all of this stuff. If you haven't attended, you'll have to just wait until the beginning of the year when these will all go live. But one of the things that we did was have some basically lightning talks. And we invited a bunch of known skeptics to just spend, 5, 6, in my case, 10 minutes talking about something that just bugs them. What do you want to? We call them rational rants, because they were just people ranting. What I ranted about is this idea that suddenly people are believing Americans are suddenly anti-science. And interestingly enough, the graphic that you showed from Pew, showing the America's trust in science, et cetera. And you were saying how, well, it was never that high to begin with, and now it's lower. And that's where my nitpicking comes in. Because I think if you look at attitudes toward scientists, medical scientists, we're way the hell up there with the military, right?
That's true.
You mentioned, elected officials. The Pew data goes down much further than that. Business people, television preachers are just on the bottom. I mean, they're just nowhere.
That's true. Well, as you know, it's all about how you ask the question, right? So,
also true.
Right.
Yeah.
So these questions are about trust. When you ask people, like it's the same thing you get when you talk about teachers, right? So when you ask people what's going on in schools, they'll say, "Oh, they're teaching all this crazy stuff. They're turning your kids trans. They're doing all this stuff." Well, how's your teacher? Well, my teacher's
my school is great.
Right? So yes, I agree with you. There's a lot of people who do trust science itself or individual scientists. That graphic is about trust. Sometimes we say if you use the word respect, it changes. So it definitely changes how you answer it, right?
And they also have confidence in science.
And confidence, right?
Those are other ways of doing it. Yeah.
And people know, like, we have AI, we have technology, we have this crazy new stuff, and they know that that's just, something that
on one level they know it works.
On one level they know it works, right? You fly to the Flat Earth Conference, right? But there is a precipitous drop post-COVID, which I think is understandable. And unfortunately, it's now split. So when you did these surveys of scientific trust in the past, there really wasn't much difference between political affiliations and trust numbers. And now there is. And so there has been some drop over time. There was a precipitous drop post-COVID. And that's due mostly to a political divide.
Mhm.
And so I do think there is a trust gap there now, and I do think that is worse. But when you tease the data apart, it is unfortunately more conservatives who are more distrustful now. And again, we can talk about the reasons for that.
And also, you did make the point, and I think this is key to my rant, that there was a decline in respect for confidence, expertise in general, and this is true. Even the other occupations as well, the military, the physicians, and so everybody's down, but it's across the board,
Right.
and so it's like
Right.
the expertise in general is gone down, but in that universe of somewhat declined expertise, we're still at the top. So what I would like to be, here's my Pollyanna leaping to the fore here.
Very fair.
I would just like people to remember that we've actually got a lot to build on in science. We have a residual strength within our culture of the power of science and the utility and the worthfulness.
Well, we're the most scientifically productive and scientifically advanced country in human history, so we have a lot to build on.
And I in my rational rant at Skeptical, I found a slide again from our beloved Pew, talking about putting your money where your mouth is. Should the country be investing in scientific research? Boom.
Yes.
Thank you, NIH. And then it was really, really high. US adults as a whole, 78% said yes, investing in science gives us good stuff over time. But to your point, there is this huge ideological gap between Democrats and Republicans. Whereas Democrats, 90%.
To confirm what you're saying, ultimately, even with the skepticism of vaccines, if you look at the vaccination rate, in the end of the day, we were high. We weren't as high as some other countries, but we were high ultimately. So even as people were skeptical and hesitant, the numbers were pretty good in the end. So you're right. People are open to persuasion. Absolutely.
By the way, if anybody is interested in not just my rational rant, but the other rational rants and the other perfectly wonderful speakers that we had, including some on denialism, and one on philosophy of science. We got Robert Pennock speaking, who was really great. You can still register at skepticalcon.com or .org, either way. We have both the domain names, and then you can look at these things right away. Otherwise, you have to wait a year until the beginning of the year. But anyway, okay, so that's my rant. And
of course, you're right.
We're basically agreeing. We're basically agreeing.
We're very, very much agreeing.
It's just a matter of emphasis. That's all.
Absolutely.
All right. I'm sure that we have some questions from the folks watching this on YouTube. So may I have the first question here? Andy Fracknoy. Andy, lovely to have you here today. How does Dr. Sinatra view those pseudosciences that promote a deeply personal benefit? Astrology promises you cosmic guidance, on whom, God, I'm having trouble with my eyes. I wish we had a bigger typeface here. Pardon me, I'm going to really get in everybody's face here. Cosmic guidance on whom to get into a relationship with or marry, a topic that otherwise comes with enormous amounts of fear and worry. That desire for personal guidance seems hard to overcome with discussions of scientific studies.
Well, one of the things I did say in my talk, Andrew, is science doesn't have answers to all questions. There's all sorts of questions science can't answer. That's one of the things about science, is knowing what it can and can't address, right? And there's all sorts of things that people can do that are great for their lives that may not have a scientific basis. And of course, if it's good for them and not harmful to them or others, of course, I have no problem with that.
Is there another question? Jay Diamond wants to know, do you have any information about the percentage of policymakers actually using science advice?
I don't have an exact number, Jay, but it used to be that science advisors were really quite common in all the highest offices, of course, the president, but cabinet members, and that has definitely been reduced. And, that's concerning. That's concerning to me, that we aren't utilizing science as much to make policy as we need to be doing. And, a lot of it went awry during COVID. Scientists made mistakes. You may remember that our first vaccine that we produced was a no-go, had a problem, right? We definitely botched the whole mask thing. We should have recommended masks from the beginning. That would have been smarter, and that would have been more consistent for people to understand. But, for reasons, having to do with supply, and they didn't do that. And then having to make that shift, people couldn't do it very easily. And it raised a lot of suspicion and distrust. So, of course, what's challenging is scientists really shouldn't be making policy.
Yeah.
Scientists should be informing policy. And I think I would agree that we didn't quite get that dividing line correct at the beginning of coronavirus. And, lots of reasons why. But
and I think as a result, to some degree, science got blamed for policy
yes.
Decisions that weren't actually scientific.
Right. Like I hear every day, well, Anthony Fauci shut down schools. Anthony Fauci did not shut down schools. That's not who shut down schools.
Even Tony isn't perfect, but that's not, you can't lay that at his feet. That's for sure.
Right.
No, we had Paul Offit speak, gosh, I don't have the dates in my mind, but a few months ago, and he was terrific. And those of you interested in this topic should take a look at our playlist for Skep Talks and watch that. We had a few hiccups with the technology, but the content was excellent. And he did go into, mistakes were made. But again, like Gail was saying, they weren't scientific mistakes especially, but they were policy errors that maybe were made on the basis of incomplete science, which, you sometimes you draw a bad hand.
Well, also, I think, I talked a lot in my talk about understanding the nature of science. I mean, this speaks back to your critique, Jeannie. People expected the scientists to be right and to be right away. And that's what led, the fact that we were like, I don't know, do you wear a mask? Do you not wear a mask? Is it aerosol? Is it touch? Do you have to wash your groceries? Freaked people out. Yeah. And I think that speaks to what you were saying earlier, is they expected the scientists to know what was going on and to give correct answers from the jump. And if you understood science, you would understand why that didn't happen. Yeah. They didn't know. It was novel. They called it a novel coronavirus for a reason. It was different. They were sorting it out. And we were watching the nature of science in real time. And for those people who didn't understand that, it looked like a hot mess, which it sort of was, but it also looked dishonest or distrustworthy or whatever. But that was because they didn't know right away. So I think it sort of speaks to your issue, is our expectation was they should have known, they should have been right from the start. And of course they weren't, and they couldn't have been.
And of course, simultaneously, this shows how complicated human reasoning and societal group reasoning can go. At the same time, the science was producing astonishing results in vaccine development. I mean, if anybody who knows, has even a small understanding of the usual way that vaccines are produced, it takes literally years. And really good vaccines were, just goes to show you what money and expertise can do. They were produced within a year. I mean, it was astonishing. What, 9 months, something like that, a gestation. And when, that remarkable science was being performed, people were saying, wait a minute, I'm suspicious. It can't be that good.
So I see a couple of good questions in the chat. There's one I'd like to address. Someone asked me, what is a refutation text, and can you give an example? And I'd love to do that, because we just published this meta-analysis, so I'm pretty excited about it. So a refutation text is a text that states a commonly held misconception, and it would say something like, some people think. It doesn't say you think or you may think. It usually says some people think. It'll state the misconception. and then it'll say that is not what scientists think. And then it'll give the scientific explanation. So it has a it's 3 parts to it. So to take your field, evolution, some people think that humans evolved from modern day apes. That is not what scientists understand to be true. What scientists understand from the research is that apes from today and humans share a common ancestor. And then it would go on to explain what that is. We've done this with evolution, climate change, genetically modified foods. Other labs have done it with vaccine hesitance, vaccine misinformation, lots of different ways you can, lots of different topics. But what's important about it is you don't say you're wrong, because as you know, people aren't really likely to change their mind when you go, hey, you're wrong. So that doesn't help. It says some people may think this isn't really correct. Here is what's correct. And the important part is you provide the scientific explanation. You just can't say it's not that, it's this. And this structure, when used correctly, is effective in helping reduce people's belief in misinformation. So we just published that. And if anyone emails me, I'll send you the study because I'm super excited about it.
I can see why. Can I have another question, please? Oh, here we go. Nope, that's the same one. From the humanist community, how do scientists navigate the moral hazards stemming from the nature of funding sources?
That is such a great question. I mean, one of the big pushbacks that, I think gets at this tension that Jeannie and I were talking about at the end of my talk is, do people mistrust, science, or do they accept science, in what proportion? Well, people mistrust big pharma, but then everybody in America is on drugs. Everybody's taking drugs, right? So I think that
which is not inconsistent.
So I think people do mistrust big pharma, big ag, and big tech, and I think there's good reasons why people have those concerns. And so I think scientists should not accept funding, from a big corporation like Pfizer, and then, come out, to, say, here's my research. Because obviously you'd want to put that firewall in there. When we were doing all this genetically modified food, we call them GMFs because we only look at GMOs that we consume. When we were looking at GMFs, we had a company who does genetic modification approach us to do a study and fund it, and we said no, we can't do that because we want to maintain a distance from any funding of a company where it could compromise people's understanding. So that's tough. But I also want to say, why are people doing that? Why are scientists taking all this corporate money? Because we've cut funding for scientific research so much that, they go where they can get the money, and that's not good.
And some scientists, alas, are not Boy Scouts. I mean, when look at the stuff that Naomi Oreskes talked about in more than one of her books, that there are scientists who just found a trough that they could feed at. And, what results do you have? I'll have them for you in 6 weeks. So,
here's the
I
thing.
think in general,
here's the thing. Science is actually conducted by humans.
Human beings. What a shock.
And so they have all the flaws that the rest of us have. Some of them are dishonest. Some of them are corrupt. Some of them are not careful. Some of them make mistakes. Some of them are on the take. Some of them aren't that smart, believe it or not, even the ones with PhDs. So just like all other humans have flaws, so do some scientists have flaws, just like anyone else. And so that's why Naomi Oreskes says it's consensus science you want to look at, never one scientist or one study, because the study could be flawed or the scientist could be flawed.
Yep. And that's why it's a collective enterprise. Howard wants to know, knowledge implies certainty. Why not replace it, I assume the word, with understanding, which implies room for growth?
Yeah, so this is something we talk about so much in psychology. Should we say beliefs? Should we say knowledge? Should we say understanding? Should we say comprehension? I've actually written papers on these things. It is really tough. Philosophers say knowledge is justified true belief. They don't all say that, but in our paper that we just discussed about refutation texts, we talked about misconceptions about science as beliefs. We talk about it as beliefs, unjustified beliefs. We didn't use the term knowledge because, as you're saying, Howard, now knowledge does seem to imply some sort of correctness. And so there are people who say you really shouldn't use that when it's misinformed information, incorrect information, misinformation. Understanding is a really different word. As a psychologist, it really is the process, not the thing. It's the process of how we come to know. It's not really the content of the knowledge. This is a long and philosophical conversation, probably goes back to Aristotle and Plato. You've asked an important question. It doesn't have simple answers. I have written a lot on this topic. I'd be happy to share some papers with you.
But I think your point is very, very true. The words do have subtly different meanings. And depending on what you're talking about, they may not be interchangeable. Can I have another question, please? Jay wants to know, how can we break through the social media echo chambers to reach science deniers? We can't influence them if they never see science or evidence.
So I'm going to say something that's going to shock everybody, and maybe Jeannie will push back on me here too. I don't think that's the ones you want to reach. And I think we've seen people who are so hunkered down, they're very hard to move. What Barbara and I talk about is the movable middle.
Mm-hmm.
So there are people who are like my niece. I mean, should I get vaccinated? I think it causes, infertility. She wasn't in denial so much as she was questioning, resisting, doubting. So those people, those are the ones you can move. And to be honest, the hardcore deniers are the smallest group. Mm-hmm. So we sadly kind of give up on those a little bit because we feel like the power in all the suggestions we shared with you tonight helps the people who are in that movable middle, the people who have questions, the people who have misunderstandings. When you clear them up, they're like, oh, I didn't know that's what a GMO was. I thought it was something different, right? So when you clear up those people absolutely shift. We see it all the time in our research. Unfortunately, some of the hardcore deniers, they really don't shift. And sadly, I think your time is better spent on those people who are more likely to shift.
I'm not going to push back. I mean, I never tried to convince creationists to come over to my perspective. But all those people who either were not ideologically opposed, their religion was such that they didn't have to reject evolution, and who just maybe didn't know very much about it. That was my target.
Right. And you'll be happy to know we've been doing research for the past couple of years with some colleagues, and I'd be happy to share some of this with you, Jeannie, particularly Elizabeth Barnes and Sarah Brownell, teaching evolution to evangelical students. And we've been having mostly their research, I just help them now and then, great impact. And it's too long a story how they've managed to do that. But one of the key things, back to social identity, they bring in evangelicals. Like, I think everybody knows Catherine Hayhoe famously is evangelical and a climate scientist. They bring in evangelical evolutionary biologists, cell biologists, and have them speak to students. That's part of what they do. They do a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah.
So it is possible to even reach those students.
But they must be reached by people who are from their identity group.
Well, that helps. And they do a lot of other things in addition. But yes, having somebody from their identity group gives
them permission. It gives them permission to think about changing.
Well, I think what is important is we're not asking them to give up their identity and who they are. Nope. And we don't want to ask them to do that. We just want them to understand this is the science, right? We're not saying you have to become a different person. We don't want them to have to leave their family and become a different person. So what the permission structure I think someone like Catherine gives is you can be a climate scientist and an evangelical, and it's okay. You don't have to give up who you are.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important example for people.
People are often quite surprised to hear that Brigham Young University's biology department has some very hotshot evolutionary
They
biology.
sure do. Really good.
Yeah, they are. Well, my friend, this has been a wonderful evening, and we've taken a lot of your time, but enjoyed every minute of it. I do thank you profusely for spending this evening with us. It was wonderful to have you here, and I know that everybody very much enjoyed hearing your talk. And thanks very, very much again. And maybe a couple of years from now, we'll get you back and learn about some more of your research, because we certainly have not exhausted it this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. And I would encourage anybody, I'm easy to find. Sinatra@usc.edu is my email. Pretty easy to find. If you have questions that you didn't get answered tonight, you can shoot me an email and I'll try my best to answer them.
Thank you. Now, for the rest of you folks, remember that eclipse last spring and the one a couple of years ago? There's a lot of folklore around about what do animals do during natural disasters, eclipses or floods or wildfires or eclipses. And there's a lot of folklore, but what does the research show? So next month, our speaker will be biologist Adam Hartstone Rose, who will be speaking about his research, which includes, by the way, some recent citizen science input about what do animals really do during eclipses. So join us an hour early next month at 6:30 p.m., not 7:30 p.m. Pacific time, Thursday, October 10, for Adam Hartstone Rose. It'll be fun. And thanks very much for coming tonight as well. See you next month.